The Story of George Washington Carver, written by Ava Moore. Chapter 6, page 31. George's brother did not stay in school long. He didn't like reading, writing, or arithmetic. But he did like the people of Neosho, so he stayed there and went to work. George still went to school, even though he had learned everything the teacher could teach him. One day George heard that some neighbors were going to leave Neosho and travel far away, to a place called Fort Scott, in the state of Kansas. Fort Scott was a bigger town than Neosho, and there was probably a free school there. George wished he could go. In a new school, there would be a new teacher, maybe one who knew about snow and hail and flowers. Top of page 32. The neighbors liked George. They told him he could go with them if he could find a place to sit in their loaded wagon. Before George left, he and Jim went to see the Carvers. George was afraid he might never come back, and he wanted to say goodbye to Aunt Susan and Uncle Moses. The traveling picture taker was there, and the boys had their picture taken together. Back in Neosho, George packed his bag. He put the Bible Aunt Maria had given him and the little blue spelling book from Aunt Susan. He put in the box with his rocks and wood carvings. There were over 500 little wooden shapes. It was hard to say goodbye to Aunt Maria and Uncle Andy. For a minute George wished he wasn't going away. But the wagon was there, waiting for him. It was loaded with pots and pans and furniture. George climbed up and found a good place to sit. He looked so small, more than a little brown bird than a 13-year-old boy. "I'll write letters," he called as the wagon started down the road. Top of page 33. The captions reads, George was about 13 years old when he and his big brother Jim had their picture taken together in Diamond Grove. Soon after, George left for Fort Scott, Kansas. He never saw his brother again. Jim died of smallpox 6 years later when George was still away in Kansas. Aunt Maria and Uncle Andy and Jim waved. They could hardly keep from crying. Then they turned around and walked sadly home. When he got to Fort Scott, George needed to find a job right away. But what kind of a job could he get? He was not strong enough to do outdoor. Top of page 34. Work. And people who needed someone for housework wanted girls. When George tried to get a house job, he was turned down again and again. Then he went to see a woman named Mrs. Payne. She had put an ad in the newspaper for a girl, but she talked to George anyway. "Can you cook?" she asked him. George thought of the simple meals he had made for Uncle Andy. That was all the cooking he knew how to do, but he needed a job, and all he said was, "Yes, ma'am." "Good!" Mrs. Payne clapped her hands. "You can cook Mr. Payne's dinner tonight. Let's see. I think we'll have honey-baked ham and sweet potatoes, biscuits, pudding, and coffee." George swallowed hard. He had never baked a ham before. He had never made biscuits or pudding. But if he told Mrs. Payne he couldn't make these things, he could never get the job. Suddenly he had an idea. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "but I want to make everything just the way you like it. If you could just show me your way of fixing everything." "Of course," Mrs. Payne said. She showed him how much honey she put on the ham. She showed him how she mixed the biscuits and the pudding. She never knew that she was really showing George how to cook everything. Mr. Payne liked his dinner, and George got the job. Before long, George learned to cook other dishes. Soon he was inventing his own recipes. Mr. Payne thought he was the best cook in Fort Scott. In Fort Scott, there was no one to take care of George. He had to look after himself. He had to earn money to buy his meals and to rent a room to sleep in. He had to work so much of the time that he could not go to school very often. When he did go to school, George learned fast. He could go through one grade twice as fast as other boys. George was small and quiet, and most people were kind to him. But some white people would pick on him and make fun of him when they saw him in the street, just because he was black. The Carvers had given George a good home. Other white people, too, had been good to him. But he, top of page 36, knew that many white people did not like any blacks. George did not know why. The Bible said it was wrong to hate another person. Hate was a sin, and a sin was a weakness in the eyes of God. Then one summer day, something terrible happened in Fort Scott. A mob of white men and women murdered a black man, and George saw everything they did. They dragged the man out of the city jail, beat him, and killed him right on the street. Their faces were full of hate. George never wanted to see those faces again. The next day he left Fort Scott for good.